The Angolan Civil War did not begin as a Cold War proxy war, but as a struggle born out of decolonization, fractured nationalism, and the collapse of imperial authority, only later becoming one of the longest and most destructive battlegrounds of the global ideological conflict. Because when Portugal's authoritarian regime finally relinquished control over its African colonies in the mid-1970s, it did so abruptly and without a coherent transition plan, leaving behind a political vacuum in Angola that competing liberation movements rushed to fill, each claiming legitimacy, each armed, and each shaped by different regional, ethnic, and ideological foundations. For decades, Portuguese colonial rule had suppressed political organization while exploiting Angola's resources and labor, preventing the emergence of unified national leadership, and instead fostering fragmented resistance movements that operated independently and often in rivalry. A fragmentation that would prove catastrophic once independence became imminent. By the early 1960s, three major movements had emerged: the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, each drawing support from different regions and constituencies, and each envisioning a different future for Angola, yet united only in their opposition to Portuguese rule, rather than in a shared national project. This absence of unity was not merely ideological, but structural, reflecting Angola's vast geography, ethnic diversity, and the colonial strategy of divide and rule, which ensured that liberation would come without consensus. When the Portuguese dictatorship collapsed in 1974 during the Carnation Revolution, Lisbon's sudden withdrawal accelerated Angola's descent into conflict, as power shifted overnight from colonial administrators to rival armed movements with no effective mechanism for compromise or shared governance. The Alvor Agreement, intended to establish a transitional government and pave the way for independence, collapsed almost immediately as apartheid, mistrust, military clashes, and external interference undermined its fragile framework, turning Angola's moment of liberation into a countdown towards civil war. This internal conflict unfolded at a moment when the Cold War was undergoing its own transformation, as superpower rivalry increasingly manifested through proxy conflicts in the developing world, making Angola a prime candidate for external intervention once its internal divisions became clear. The MPLA, rooted in urban centers and influenced by Marxist ideology, cultivated relationships with the Soviet Union and Cuba, framing its struggle as part of a broader anti-imperialist movement and appealing to socialist solidarity for support, while UNITA, initially aligned with Maoist ideas before shifting toward pragmatic anti-communism, drew backing from rural populations and later from the United States and South Africa, as global powers sought local partners who could advance their strategic interests. The FNLA, supported early by neighboring Zaire and the United States, gradually lost relevance as the conflict intensified, illustrating how external sponsorship could sustain movements temporarily but not guarantee long-term viability. What transformed Angola's civil war into a Cold War epicenter was not ideology alone, but the strategic calculations of external actors who saw Angola as a gateway to influence in southern Africa, a region already destabilized by apartheid, liberation struggles, and competing security interests. For the United States, Angola represented a test of credibility in the Third World, as policymakers feared that allowing a Soviet-aligned movement to consolidate power would signal retreat and embolden adversaries elsewhere, even as public memory of Vietnam made direct intervention politically toxic. For the Soviet Union, Angola offered an opportunity to expand influence at relatively low cost by supporting an allied movement that could reshape regional balance and demonstrate the global reach of socialist solidarity. Cuba's intervention, however, would become the most decisive and controversial external involvement. As Havana deployed tens of thousands of troops to Angola, not merely as proxies, but as active combatants, transforming a localized civil war into an internationalized conflict, and challenging assumptions about the limits of superpower competition. Cuba framed its involvement as a moral duty to support anti-colonial struggle, yet its actions also aligned closely with Soviet strategic objectives, illustrating how ideological commitment and geopolitical calculation often overlapped in Cold War interventions. South Africa's role further complicated the conflict, as the apartheid regime intervened militarily to prevent the emergence of a hostile, Soviet-aligned government on its border, framing its actions as defensive while entrenching Angola within a broader regional war involving Namibia and the struggle against apartheid itself. As independence arrived on November 11, 1975, it did not bring peace but formalized division, with the MPLA declaring itself the government in Luanda, while UNITA and its allies rejected the outcome, plunging the country into full-scale civil war. The timing of independence coincided with escalating foreign intervention, as Cuban troops secured key positions for the MPLA and South African forces advanced in support of UNITA, creating a direct confrontation between opposing Cold War camps on African soil. The United States, constrained by domestic politics, yet unwilling to concede influence, supported anti-MPLA forces covertly, reinforcing the proxy nature of the conflict, even as it avoided overt military engagement. Angola thus became a laboratory for Cold War warfare in the developing world, where local grievances, liberation narratives, and superpower rivalry fused into a prolonged struggle that would devastate the country's population while serving as a stage for global competition. The scale of violence escalated rapidly as modern weapons flowed into the country, displacing civilians, destroying infrastructure, and embedding militarization into everyday life, while diplomatic efforts failed to keep pace with the momentum of armed confrontation. Angola's vast territory and resource wealth, including oil and diamonds, further fueled the conflict, providing both incentive and means for prolonged warfare as control over resources became intertwined with military survival. For ordinary Angolans, independence marked the beginning of decades of instability, as the promise of self-determination was consumed by a war that would last far longer than colonial rule itself, illustrating how the Cold War could transform liberation into entrapment. The early phase of the Angolan Civil War thus reveals a core pattern of Cold War conflict, where decolonization created openings that global powers filled not with stability but with arms, turning local struggles into internationalized wars, whose duration and intensity far exceeded the original causes. Angola's descent into civil war was not inevitable, but once the Cold War logic of alignment and proxy confrontation took hold, it became extraordinarily difficult to reverse, setting the stage for a conflict that would persist for decades and become one of the most devastating examples of how global rivalry could consume a nation from within. As the Angolan Civil War expanded beyond its initial post-independence phase, it evolved into a deeply entrenched proxy conflict that absorbed regional and global rivalries into its internal dynamics. Because once foreign forces committed themselves militarily and politically, the war ceased to be primarily about Angola's future and became instead a contest over influence, credibility, and strategic positioning within the Cold War system. The early victories of the MPLA, secured in part by Cuban intervention that halted South African advances and stabilized control over Luanda, did not bring consolidation or reconciliation, but rather hardened the lines of conflict as UNITA retreated inland and reorganized its forces with renewed external backing transforming the war into a long-term struggle characterized by shifting front lines, cycles of escalation, and persistent civilian suffering. Cuba's presence grew rapidly, with tens of thousands of troops deployed to defend the MPLA government, not as temporary advisors, but as a standing expeditionary force, marking one of the most significant overseas military commitments of the Cold War by a non-superpower, and demonstrating how ideological solidarity could translate into sustained, high-risk intervention far from home. Havana justified this involvement as a continuation of anti-colonial struggle and internationalism. Yet the scale and duration of its deployment also reflected Soviet strategic calculations, as Angola offered Moscow a means to project influence in southern Africa without direct confrontation with the United States, relying instead on Allied forces to secure objectives while preserving plausible distance. The Soviet Union supplied arms, training, and logistical support, embedding Angola within its global network of aligned states and reinforcing the MPLA's dependence on external backing for survival, a dependence that shaped the government's internal politics and constrained its autonomy. On the opposing side, UNITA capitalized on Cold War anxieties to secure support from the United States, which viewed the conflict through the lens of containment and credibility, fearing that a consolidated Marxist government in Angola would embolden Soviet influence across Africa and undermine Western positions in a region already destabilized by apartheid and liberation wars. American support, often covert and indirect, due to domestic political constraints following Vietnam, nonetheless provided UNITA with resources that sustained its capacity to fight, illustrating how even limited engagement could prolong proxy wars by preventing decisive outcomes. South Africa's continued intervention further entrenched the conflict, as Pretoria pursued its own security objectives by striking UNITA's enemies and disrupting MPLA control near its borders, framing these operations as preemptive defense while reinforcing Angola's role as a regional battleground linked to the struggle over Namibia and the survival of apartheid. These overlapping interventions created a complex web of motivations that ensured no single actor controlled the trajectory of the war, as each pursued distinct goals that converged on the same battlefield, producing a conflict resistant to settlement because peace for one party often implied strategic loss for another. The Angolan Civil War thus entered a phase of stalemate, punctuated by offensives and counter-offensives, with neither side capable of delivering a decisive blow so long as external support remained available, a condition that transformed warfare into a permanent feature of governance and survival. Internally, the MPLA government faced the challenge of ruling a devastated country while prosecuting an ongoing war, relying on centralized authority, security services, and external assistance to maintain control, a dynamic that limited political pluralism and reinforced authoritarian practices justified by the demands of national defense. UNITA, operating as a guerrilla movement with territorial control in parts of the interior, developed parallel structures of administration and coercion, embedding itself within local communities while exploiting resources, particularly diamonds, to finance its war effort, demonstrating how protracted conflict can produce alternative systems of power that thrive on instability. For civilians, this phase of the war was marked by displacement, famine, and pervasive insecurity, as fighting disrupted agriculture, destroyed infrastructure, and made normal life impossible across vast regions, turning Angola into one of the most heavily landmined countries in the world, and ensuring that the war's effects would persist long after combat subsided. The Cold War context amplified these human costs, because diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict were repeatedly subordinated to strategic calculations, as ceasefires and negotiations collapsed when they threatened to alter the balance of external influence. Angola became emblematic of a broader pattern in which proxy wars were sustained not by local irreconcilability alone, but by the willingness of distant powers to absorb the human cost in pursuit of abstract strategic goals. The continuation of the Angolan Civil War through the late 1970s and early 1980s thus reveals how Cold War rivalry transformed regional conflicts into self-perpetuating systems of violence, where peace was elusive not because it was unimaginable, but because it was incompatible with the interests and fears that global powers projected onto a nation struggling to define itself after colonial rule. As the war dragged into the 1980s, the Angolan Civil War reached a scale and intensity that made it impossible to separate military operations from the broader Cold War balance, because Angola had become a central arena where global power, regional ambition, and local survival collided, producing a conflict whose outcomes were measured not only in territory gained or lost, but in credibility preserved or eroded across continents. The MPLA government, entrenched in Luanda and sustained by Cuban troops and Soviet materiel, sought to transform military survival into political consolidation, attempting to assert control over a fractured country while managing the demands and constraints imposed by its external patrons, whose priorities did not always align with Angola's internal needs. This dependence shaped policy and strategy, as decisions about offensives, negotiations, and resource allocation were influenced by the expectations of allies who viewed Angola as a strategic asset rather than a sovereign project, reinforcing the reality that proxy wars often subordinate local agency to external calculation. UNITA, meanwhile, adapted to the realities of prolonged conflict by refining its guerrilla tactics and deepening its reliance on external support, particularly from the United States and South Africa, which viewed the movement as a bulwark against communist expansion, despite mounting evidence of the war's devastating humanitarian impact. American policymakers framed their involvement within the language of containment and credibility, arguing that withdrawal or accommodation would signal weakness. Yet this framing obscured the fact that sustaining UNITA contributed directly to prolonging a war that neither side could decisively win. South Africa's role intensified during this period, as Pretoria conducted major cross-border operations aimed at crippling MPLA and Cuban forces, linking the Angolan conflict to its own struggle against regional liberation movements and embedding the war within a larger Southern African security complex defined by apartheid, insurgency, and superpower rivalry. These operations culminated in large-scale conventional battles that challenged the assumption that proxy wars remained limited, as mechanized units, air power, and heavy artillery were deployed in engagements that rivaled interstate warfare in scale, demonstrating how Cold War conflicts in the developing world could escalate far beyond guerrilla skirmishes. The presence of Cuban forces proved decisive in preventing the collapse of the MPLA government, as their training, discipline, and willingness to engage South African units altered the balance on the battlefield, transforming Angola into a rare case where a small state projected sustained military power across an ocean in defense of ideological and strategic objectives. For the Soviet Union, this phase of the war underscored both the opportunities and limits of proxy intervention, as support for the MPLA extended influence but also drained resources and tied Moscow to a conflict whose resolution remained elusive, reinforcing internal debates about the cost of maintaining global commitments during a period of economic strain and political stagnation. The war's escalation intensified civilian suffering, as major battles displaced populations, disrupted food production, and deepened famine, revealing how the militarization of Cold War competition translated into human catastrophe far from the centers of decision-making. Humanitarian crises became chronic rather than episodic, as aid efforts were repeatedly undermined by insecurity and political manipulation, turning relief into another instrument of leverage within the conflict. The persistence of violence eroded any remaining illusions that military victory would bring stability, as both sides discovered that territorial gains were fragile and dependent on continuous force, while the underlying political fragmentation of Angola remained unresolved. This realization gradually shifted calculations among external actors, as the costs of indefinite engagement became harder to justify amid changing global conditions, including the waning intensity of Cold War rivalry and the emergence of new priorities that challenged the logic of perpetual proxy war. Angola thus entered a phase where the exhaustion of war intersected with shifts in the international system, setting the stage for diplomatic efforts that would seek not immediate reconciliation but managed disengagement, reflecting a broader Cold War pattern in which conflicts were resolved not through decisive victory, but through negotiated withdrawal once strategic imperatives changed. Yet even as these conditions emerged, the legacy of years of proxy warfare ensured that any transition would be fragile, burdened by mistrust, militarization, and the scars of prolonged violence, illustrating how Cold War conflicts left behind deeply damaged societies long after external actors began to reconsider their commitments. By the late 1980s, the Angolan Civil War entered a decisive, yet deeply paradoxical phase, as the conflict's persistence collided with a transforming global environment in which the Cold War itself was beginning to lose coherence, forcing external powers to reassess a war they had long sustained but could no longer justify in its existing form. The battlefield realities had reached a point of strategic saturation, where continued escalation promised diminishing returns and mounting costs, particularly for the Soviet Union, which was grappling with economic crisis, political reform, and a growing recognition that its global commitments exceeded its capacity to sustain them. Angola became emblematic of this reassessment, as Soviet leaders increasingly viewed the conflict not as a source of strategic advantage, but as a liability that drained resources and tied Moscow to an intractable war far from its core interests. This shift did not reflect sudden altruism or ideological abandonment, but a pragmatic recalibration driven by the realization that prolonged proxy warfare undermined the very stability the Soviet system sought to preserve. Cuba, whose forces had borne the brunt of combat, faced similar pressures, as the human and economic costs of its overseas deployment weighed heavily on a small island nation already under strain, prompting Havana to reconsider the sustainability of its intervention, even as it remained committed to the principles that had justified it. On the opposing side, the United States and South Africa also confronted changing calculations, as geopolitical priorities shifted and the moral and political costs of supporting a prolonged civil war became increasingly difficult to ignore, particularly in the context of global condemnation of apartheid and growing domestic skepticism toward proxy interventions. These converging pressures created a narrow opening for diplomacy, not because the underlying causes of the Angolan conflict had been resolved, but because the external scaffolding that had sustained it was weakening. The pivotal moment came with negotiations that linked Angola's future to broader regional settlements, recognizing that the conflict could not be addressed in isolation from the interconnected struggles of Southern Africa, particularly the war in neighboring Namibia and the presence of South African forces across borders. Diplomatic efforts culminated in agreements that called for the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola and South African forces from Namibia, marking a rare instance in which a Cold War proxy conflict was partially disentangled through negotiated disengagement rather than military victory. This outcome reflected a broader shift in Cold War practice, as superpowers increasingly sought to reduce risk and exposure by resolving peripheral conflicts that no longer served strategic necessity. The withdrawal of Cuban forces, completed over several years, symbolized the end of one of the Cold War's most extensive overseas military deployments and signaled a profound change in how ideological solidarity was balanced against national survival. For Angola, however, the departure of foreign troops did not bring peace, because the internal conflict between the MPLA and UNITA remained unresolved, revealing how deeply the war's dynamics had become rooted in domestic power struggles, resource control, and mutual distrust cultivated over decades of violence. The collapse of the Cold War's external framework removed some constraints, but also stripped away the incentives that had pushed factions toward compromise, leaving Angola to confront the legacy of proxy war without the mediating pressure of superpower rivalry. Attempts at internal settlement faltered repeatedly as ceasefires broke down and elections failed to produce acceptance of outcomes, demonstrating how years of militarization had eroded political norms and entrenched zero-sum thinking. The end of the Cold War thus exposed the limits of proxy disengagement, showing that while external actors could withdraw, the structures of violence they had helped create could not be dismantled so easily. Angola's continued suffering into the post-Cold War era underscored a central truth about Cold War conflicts, that their human and institutional consequences often outlived the geopolitical logic that gave rise to them. The war's persistence revealed how external intervention, even when justified by ideology or security, can distort internal politics so profoundly that peace becomes elusive long after the original strategic motivations fade. In this sense, the Angolan Civil War stands as a bridge between the Cold War and its aftermath, illustrating how global rivalry reshaped local conflicts in ways that could not be undone simply by changing international alignments. The transition away from superpower competition did not erase Angola's wounds, but it did reveal the full cost of a war sustained for decades by forces far removed from the communities that bore its consequences, setting the stage for a final reckoning with the legacy of one of the Cold War's longest and most devastating proxy wars. The closing phase of the Angolan Civil War exposes how deeply the Cold War had reshaped the country's political and social foundations, because once the global rivalry that sustained the conflict receded, Angola was left to confront a war that had become self-perpetuating, driven by internal dynamics forged under decades of militarization, mistrust, and external manipulation, revealing that proxy wars do not simply end when their sponsors depart. The MPLA government, now operating in a post-Cold War environment, attempted to reframe its legitimacy through political reform and elections. Yet these efforts collided with the reality that institutions built for survival, under constant threat, were ill-equipped for pluralism, compromise, or power sharing, particularly when armed rivals retained the capacity to reject outcomes they found unacceptable. UNITA's refusal to accept electoral defeat and its return to armed struggle demonstrated how prolonged conflict erodes faith in political processes, as leaders accustomed to resolving disputes through force struggled to transition to civilian competition, a pattern common to many Cold War proxy conflicts where militarization outpaced institution building. The renewed fighting that followed shattered hopes for rapid peace, plunging Angola back into cycles of violence that further devastated civilian life and reinforced the sense that independence had delivered not sovereignty but endless instability. Resource wealth, particularly diamonds, played an increasingly central role in sustaining the conflict during this period, as control over extraction provided both motive and means for continued warfare, illustrating how Cold War-era conflicts often mutated into resource-driven wars once ideological sponsorship declined. For ordinary Angolans, the distinction between Cold War proxy war and post-Cold War civil conflict was meaningless, as displacement, landmines, famine, and insecurity remained constant features of life, underscoring how the human costs of superpower rivalry persist long after strategic objectives have shifted. International engagement during this phase focused largely on humanitarian relief and conflict management rather than decisive resolution, reflecting a broader post-Cold War tendency to address symptoms rather than causes, as the international community grappled with the limits of its influence in conflicts shaped by decades of violence. Eventual steps toward peace came not through sudden reconciliation, but through exhaustion, leadership change, and the gradual erosion of armed capacity, culminating in agreements that reflected the recognition that continued war offered no strategic or political gain for any party. The death of UNITA's leader marked a turning point, reducing the movement's cohesion and opening space for demobilization. Yet even this moment highlighted how personal authority and militarized leadership structures, products of prolonged conflict, could determine the fate of entire nations. The formal end of large-scale fighting brought relief but not resolution, as Angola emerged with deep scars in its social fabric, economy, and political culture, shaped by years in which war had been the organizing principle of society. The legacy of the Angolan Civil War thus extends far beyond its battlefield chronology, offering a stark illustration of how Cold War proxy conflicts deform states from within, leaving behind institutions optimized for survival rather than governance, and populations conditioned to insecurity as a norm. Angola's experience reveals that the Cold War's most enduring damage was often inflicted not at moments of crisis, but through prolonged entanglement, as global powers transformed local struggles into extended wars whose consequences outlasted the ideological battles that justified them. In this sense, the Angolan Civil War stands as one of the clearest examples of how the Cold War consumed entire societies, converting aspirations for liberation into decades of destruction, and demonstrating that while global rivalries may end, the conflicts they ignite can continue to burn long after the world has moved on. The ultimate meaning of the Angolan Civil War emerges only when viewed as a complete Cold War system, rather than a single national tragedy, because the conflict demonstrates how global rivalry could capture a newly independent state and reshape its destiny for generations, turning decolonization into prolonged catastrophe through the logic of proxy warfare, where victory mattered less than endurance and alignment mattered more than reconciliation. Angola's war shows that Cold War interventions rarely resolved local problems and instead amplified them, as external powers armed factions, hardened divisions, and insulated leaders from accountability, ensuring that compromise became politically impossible and violence became the default language of power. What began as a struggle over Angola's post-colonial future was transformed into a contest over ideological credibility and strategic positioning, in which the lives of civilians became collateral to calculations made in distant capitals, illustrating the asymmetry at the heart of the Cold War, where peripheral societies absorbed the costs of stability at the center. The prolonged nature of the war reveals how proxy conflicts could persist long after their original motivations faded, sustained by militarized institutions, resource extraction, and leadership structures shaped by years of violence, making peace not merely a political challenge, but a cultural and psychological one. Angola's experience underscores the illusion that external support provides security because, while it enabled factions to survive militarily, it also trapped them in dependency and conflict, preventing the emergence of autonomous political solutions and embedding instability into the state itself. The war's conclusion, arriving through exhaustion rather than reconciliation, highlights the limits of Cold War disengagement, showing that withdrawal of external powers does not undo the damage caused by decades of intervention, and that societies emerging from proxy wars must rebuild not only infrastructure, but trust, legitimacy, and shared identity. Angola's post-war struggles reflect this burden. As reconstruction unfolded alongside persistent inequality and political centralization, legacies of a system that prioritized survival over inclusion and control over consensus. In the broader Cold War narrative, the Angolan Civil War stands as one of the clearest examples of how ideological conflict became self-perpetuating when exported into fragile contexts, producing wars that outlived the era that created them, and leaving behind landscapes marked by landmines, displacement, and unresolved trauma. Its history challenges simplified accounts of the Cold War as a largely bloodless standoff between superpowers, revealing instead a world in which violence was outsourced to the periphery and sustained through local suffering, while global stability was preserved through distance and abstraction. Angola's story forces a confrontation with the moral cost of proxy strategy, showing that the avoidance of direct superpower war came at the price of prolonged devastation elsewhere, a trade-off rarely acknowledged in contemporary memory. The Angolan Civil War thus serves as both a warning and a record, demonstrating how global systems can consume national futures when ideology and security override human consequence, and how conflicts shaped by external rivalry leave legacies that persist long after the flags change and alliances dissolve. In understanding Angola, we see the Cold War stripped of its strategic language and revealed in its most concrete form as a force that transformed liberation into entrapment and left behind a nation that survived not because the war made sense, but because its people endured, carrying forward the scars of a conflict that was never truly theirs to begin with.